Here is a brief introduction to the story, The Last Lesson. The Prussian forces under Bismarck attacked France in the year 1870. All the Germans stood by Prussia and France was defeated. The French district of Alsace and Lorraine passed into Prussian hands. The new Prussian rulers disallowed the teaching of French in school of these two districts. The French teachers in these schools were asked to leave. The story described the last day of one such French teacher in his school. Though he knows he had been transferred and had no longer remained in his old school, he gave his last lesson to his students with as much devotion and sincerity as ever. The story brings out the pathos of the whole situations and also depicts the quiet dignity of the French teacher named M. Hamel. Detailed summary of the story. Little Franz started for school very late that morning. He was in great fear of scolding. His teacher, Mr. Hamel, had said that he would ask questions on participles. Little Franz did not know even one word about them. For a moment, he thought of running away and spending the day out of doors. It was a bright and lovely day. The birds were chirping. The Prussian soldiers were drilling in open field. Watching them seemed far more tempting than the rule of participles. However, little Franz hurried off to school. When he passed the town hall, there was a crowd in front of the bulletin board. For the last 2 years, all bad news had come from there. Little Franz did not stop there, but he thought to himself, what can be better now? The little boy hurried by as fast as he could. The village blacksmith who was reading the bulletin called after him, saying, don't go so fast, boy. You'll get to your school in a plenty of time. Franz thought blacksmith was making fun of him. When he reached the school, he was all out of breath. Usually, when school began, there was a great bustle. All sorts of sound can be heard out in the street. The opening and closing of desks, lesson repeated in unison, and the teacher's ruler rapping on the table. But now it was all very still. Little Franz had thought that he would get into his desk without being seen. But that day everything was quiet as Sunday morning. Through the window, he saw his classmates already in their places. The teacher, Mr. Hamel, was walking up and down with his terrible iron ruler under his arm. Little Franz had to open the door and go in before everybody. He was really very frightened, but when Mr. Hamel saw him, he said very kindly, go to your place quickly, little Franz. We were beginning without you. Franz jumped over the bench and sat down at his desk. By now, he had got a little over his fright. He saw that his teacher was in a beautiful green coat and frilled shirt. He had a little black silk cap, all embroidered. He never wore his dress except on inspection and prize days. The whole school seemed too strange, but the thing that surprised Franz most was that on the back benches, the village people were sitting quietly like little students. Among them were old Hazel, the former postmaster, and several others. Everybody looked sad. Hazel had brought an old primer. He held it open on his knees. While little Franz was wondering about it all, Mr. Hamel began in a very grave and gentle tone. My children, this is the last lesson I shall give you. The order has come from Berlin to teach only German in the schools of Alsace and Lorraine. The new master comes tomorrow. This is your last French lesson. I want you to be very attentive. These words came like a thunderbolt to little Franz. Now he understood what they had put up at the town hall. It was going to be his last French lesson, and he hardly knew how to write. How sorry he was for not learning his lessons and for seeking Bart's eggs. His book had always seemed such nuisance to him. They had seemed very heavy to carry, but now they seemed to him old friends that he could not give up, and he was so sad to think that Mr. Hamel was going away and that he would never see him again. He forgot all about his ruler and how cranky he was. It was in honor of this last lesson that Mr. Hamel had put on his fine clothes. Now, little Franz understood why the old men of the village were sitting there in the back of the room. They were also sorry that they had not gone to school more often. They had come to thank Mr. Hamel for his 40 years of faithful service. While little Franz was thinking all this, he heard his name called. He was asked to decide the rule for participles, but he got mixed up on the first words and stood there, holding onto his desk. His heart was beating fast, and he did not dare to look up. Mr. Hamel said, "I won't scold you, little Franz. You must be feeling bad for yourself. Every day you have said to yourself, 'I have plenty of time, I'll learn it tomorrow.' And now you see where we have come to. There's a great trouble with all of us. We put off learning till tomorrow. Now, those Prussians will say to you, 'You pretend to be a Frenchman, and yet you can neither speak nor write your own languages.' But you are not the only one, little Franz. We all have a great deal to reproach ourselves with. Your parents were not anxious enough to have you learn. They preferred to put you to work on a farm or at the mills, so as to have a little more money. And I've been blamed also. I have often sent you to water my flowers instead of learning your lessons. And when I wanted to go fishing, I just gave you a holiday." Then Mr. Hamel talked of the French language. He said that it was the most beautiful language in the world. He called it the clearest and most logical of all languages. He said that when a people are enslaved, they can be said to have a key to their prison as long as they hold fast to their language. Then he opened a grammar and read his last lesson. Little Franz was amazed to see how well he understood it. Everything seemed so easy, and he had never listened so carefully, and Mr. Hamel had never explained everything with so much patience. It seemed as if he wanted to give his students all he knew before going away. After the grammar, Mr. Hamel gave a lesson in writing. That day, he had new copies for his students, written in beautiful round hand. "France, Alsace, France, Alsace." They looked like little flags floating everywhere in the schoolroom. Everyone set to work. Once some beetles flew in, but nobody paid any attention. On the roof, the pigeons cooed very low, and little Franz thought to himself, "Will they make them sing in German?" Mr. Hamel sat motionless in his chair, gazing first at one thing and then at another. It was as if he wanted to fix everything in his mind. For 40 years, he had been there in the same place. It must have broken his heart to think that he had to leave it all. He could hear his sister moving about in the room above. They were to leave the next day. After the writing, at the back of the room, old Hazel had put on his spectacles and was holding his primer in both hands. He was spelling the letters with other children. He was crying too. His voice trembled with emotion. All at once, the church clock struck 12. At the same moment, the trumpets of the Prussians were heard. They were returning from their drill. Mr. Hamel stood up and began to say, "My friends, I. But something choked him. He could not go on. Then he turned to his blackboard, took a piece of chalk, and wrote as large as he could, "Long live France."